So anyway, it is my pleasure to present to introduce tonight's presenter, Bill Hyder, who will be discussing the Swiss Hotel Hospitality for Swiss Immigrants in Santa Cruz, California.
All right, I think I'm ready to go. So I'm going to talk tonight about the Swiss Hotel and the Swiss Hotel tokens from Santa Cruz, California. The first Swiss settled in Santa Cruz sometime between 1868 and 1870. About 30,000 Swiss Italians immigrated to California in the 1860s. The ones who settled in the Santa Cruz area, and probably most of the area around Northern California, were from the Ticino Canton. That's in southern Switzerland on the border with Italy, so they speak Italian, and that's why I will talk about Swiss sometimes and sometimes Swiss Italians, because they are kind of that mixed heritage. They were attracted to California after the gold rush, primarily because of the prospects for dairy farming and the potential for vineyards in California. Businessmen came, bought property, and started their various kinds of businesses, but a large number of single young men came as well. They came knowing that the families that came before them would need labor. And what's interesting, if you look at this early history, they're all single young men, but most of them, before they left Switzerland, had made arrangements for women who would become their wives. So they had relationships before they left, and they promised to send for the women once they got settled, and that in fact happened. I can say for myself, I grew up in Humboldt County in a little town called Lolita, and there were a large number of Italian Swiss families there. So the culture stayed more or less intact. They became Americans and adopted, American lives, but they still held on to that Swiss Italian identity. Right into the current time. And in Santa Cruz, there are fishermen and restaurateurs, et cetera, that still can trace their history back to these early Swiss immigrants. The other thing that might be familiar to you is the Italian Swiss colony wine, which I went past all the time as a young kid from Humboldt County coming down to San Francisco. But the Swiss colony of California, as shown on this medal, is not the winery. It's the social organizations that maintain their ties with Switzerland and celebrated the 600th anniversary of the Republic, the creation of the Swiss Republic. That was in 1891, and they issued this medal that comes in both silver and white metal for a big picnic they had. I believe it was in Oakland in 1891. As they were arriving in Santa Cruz around 1868, this is a photograph from 1868 of, my mouse should be visible up there. On this side of the photograph would be what was called Chinatown, and there's Chinese laundries, there's livery stables. There was a hotel here, or a boarding house, called the Swiss Union. On this side is where most of the businesses and the more fancy hotels and stuff were located. The dividing building here is still I'm going to forget the word right now. it's a triangular building that still occupies this position in a small statue and so forth. But this is the area of the main part of Santa Cruz, and just out of the picture to the left is where the Swiss Hotel was constructed. So it was built behind the Chinatown and just shy of the river that flows through Santa Cruz. And at that time it was on Bridge Street. That's where the bridge ran over the river. So here in 1877, these are the Sanborn fire maps. Here's the view you were looking at in the last picture, this Flatiron building here. That's the word I was trying to think of. There's livery stables, there's various kind of businesses. And right here where it says saloon, lodgings and saloon is the Swiss Hotel. Behind all of this stuff was a marshy area, and the owners of the Swiss Hotel had to go to the city council and complain about the hotels that are down here, the Santa Cruz Hotel, the Pacific Ocean House, the fancy hotels that are on the main street, dumped all of their sewage into this vacant lot and marshy area. And so many people staying at the Swiss Hotel were having health problems due to the raw sewage that they had to breathe every day. But still, the hotel was doing well. They added a second story. And in 1874, the Swiss Mutual Benevolent Society expanded from San Francisco into Santa Cruz. And the benevolent societies were like other fraternal societies. In this point in time, there wasn't regular health care. And so when you joined a benevolent society, you had access to some form of health care. If you died, they made arrangements for your burial. So it was a way for people with a common background to make friends and be part of a community in the town where they're living. And the benevolent society operated out of the Swiss Hotel. This is the 1886 Sanborn fire map. Now we can see that the Swiss Hotel has expanded some. In 1877, one of the Chinese laundries down here caught fire. It spread rapidly to the Swanton Hotel. And this presented a problem for the city because they didn't own the water supply system. The water supply system was on a hill above downtown. It was privately owned. And if it was not turned on to allow a free flow of water, they didn't have water pressure. And they did not have enough water pressure to actually stop the fire. And so most of Chinatown burned along with all of these buildings, and it ended up burning the Swiss Hotel. The Swiss Hotel was rebuilt, but the owner of the hotel had himself insured, had the building insured for himself. The leaseholders did not have insurance, and they ended up leaving the hotel business and opened a saloon when Chinatown was rebuilt. When the Swiss Hotel was rebuilt, it was leased to a man by the name of Varosa. He had a small house next to the Swiss Hotel that burned. He was a shoemaker, but obviously he decided to do something else and took out the lease on the Swiss Hotel. And in 1890, he renewed the lease with a man by the name of Joseph Rossi as his partner. The hotel, when it reopened, offered the choicest wines and liquors, according to people in town. If you were Swiss and you were enrolled in the Swiss Benevolent Society, if you were injured at work or needed other forms of medical treatment, you were taken to the Swiss hotel. And it was quite a lively place. What's interesting is this ads list Varosa and Rossi as proprietors. I tried to research Joseph Rossi as his partner, and the Rossi family was a large family in Santa Cruz, but the only Joseph Rossi I was able to find actually lived up the river in Ben Lomond or Boulder Creek area and was a farmer. So I don't think he's the person here who is listed as one of the proprietors. And when we look at the tokens, these are the first tokens issued. It's Rossi and Varosa as opposed to Varosa and Rossi. And so my assumption is that Rossi was partner to run the bar while Varosa ran the hotel. So when the hotel was being advertised, it was Varosa and Rossi, but the tokens actually say Rossi and Varosa because they would have operated in the bar as opposed to the hotel itself. And these are Jacob and Strawley tokens signed in San Francisco, good for a 5-cent drink and good for a 10-cent drink. The 10-cent token is unlisted. I shouldn't have gone forward, but let me explain the tokens a little more. I'm not sure what just happened there in advancing things. The Strawley tokens are a good indicator that billiards were a popular pastime in the bar. So they obviously had Jacob Strawley billiard tables, but the tokens could be used in a number of different ways. Tokens could be used in card games and other forms of gambling. And so if you had the tokens, you could use them for betting. But most likely the tokens were used that when you did have a card game, the house would take a share of the pots. And generally what they would do is they would take money out of the pot and put a token in to replace it. So they both took their cut of the game as a profit. And then when you use the token to buy a beer, they made a little extra money because the 5 cents would have been a profit on the beer. But however they were being used, the hotel was popular enough that they had to expand it, to expand the number of rooms. They had to raise the hotel another 2 feet because the street in front of the hotel was raised above the floodwater level. So there were problems. In 1890, downtown Santa Cruz was flooded and a number of businesses had to make these kinds of arrangements. Now this slide comes in the proper order. In 1901, Varosa sold his interest to John Berta and Ricardo Mattel. Varosa said he was ready for arrest after 14 years, but he later became proprietor of the Golden West Saloon before he retired in 1911 for the second time and passed away in 1913. What's interesting is Rossi no longer appears. When the hotel was sold, it was sold by Varosa. So where Rossi went, I'm assuming that he did not actually have half interest in the hotel. What he had was interest in the bar. And no one actually owned the hotel. They were all leaseholders. The original person who built the hotel maintained ownership through all of this time and leased the hotel out to different people. So Mattel sold his half interest to D.N. Codega in 1903 for $275. So that gives you an idea of what he's selling is his half interest in the lease, not half interest in the actual building and its contents. Berta sold his interest to Querco Borodori in November 1903. Borodori had immigrated from Switzerland himself. He first moved to Gilroy and became a dairy farmer. That apparently didn't hold his interest or wasn't profitable. He moved to San Luis Obispo, where he bought a restaurant. And shortly after that, he left the restaurant in San Luis Obispo, moved to Salinas, where he took up ranching. And from that point, he moved to Santa Cruz and got interest in the Swiss Hotel and became owner of the Swiss Hotel. What we're looking at in this picture is from, this would be the center of town at the bottom of the picture. We're looking kind of northeast at the Swiss Hotel. In front of it was Bridge Street, later Water Street. The tree line in the back marks the river basin, and there are some buildings back in here, such as the Universal Hotel, that in time those flooded out again and disappeared from history. The location here on the corner would have been where the Swanton House Hotel was, that burned to the ground earlier in history. That open lot, which you see in this picture, is where the post office was built in Santa Cruz. And that post office is the one that still stands today. And a little bit later in history, we're going to get to the Swiss American Hotel, and that was constructed in this building, but that's premature in our history right now. Here's the Swiss Hotel to give you an idea of what it's like. In the 1910s, the hotel had to be raised again because of flooding from the river. That continued to be a problem in Santa Cruz until the levee was built. And I'm not sure what year that was, but that's where those buildings that are in the photograph off next to the river, that all disappeared to build the levee. Borodori himself was active in the Italian-Swiss social life, and there are records in the newspaper that he was in a small band, and he would play his accordion and was accompanied by a man on drums and cymbals. And so he was very active, and these are the kinds of activities that I remember from my childhood in Lolita, growing up in an Italian-Swiss small town. Saturday night parties were were a lot of fun. In Lolita, it was Friendly Corners. And we kids, it was a bar and restaurant, and the owner of the bar and restaurant, his family lived next door to where I lived, and all of us kids would go down on Friday night and have raviolis and great Italian food. And Borodori was an important part of that kind of social life in Santa Cruz throughout that time. And those activities continue until today. So if we look at the 1917 fire map, here's now Water Street. The Swiss Hotel has expanded. The post office is here. This street still exists. It's not called Eagle Street anymore, but it gives you an idea of the layout along the river at that point in time. And this is where we encounter the first Swiss hotel token signed by Q. Borodori. I I don't know the exact date of this. It's obviously not a slot machine token because it's octagonal. This one has been canceled. It's the only one that I'm aware of. Where the first tokens were made by Jacob Strawley, I believe based upon this reverse style, that this may be an LA rubber stamp token, and you can see the die crack along here. So this was towards the end of the life of this die. It's the only token of this type that I have encountered. There's also a Swiss hotel token made by Patrick that's 21 millimeters in size. That's typical size for a slot machine. It's hard to believe that there would be a restaurant and bar in Santa Cruz at this time that didn't have at least one slot machine. And in 1906, Bordori was one of 40 business owners that agreed to eliminate money-paying slot machines by September 30th, 1906. Merchandise machines, machines that paid out gum or cigars or what have you, were still legal, but the monetized machines were not legal. So this token likely dates to 1906. Although if you study the history, money-paying slot machines continued to be used long after the proprietors agreed they would no longer use them. So this is probably a Patrick token of sometime around 1905 is my best guess. In 1918, the hotel sold to the Macosi brothers. They were another Italian family. They bought the business from Bordori, and they were repeatedly raided for possession of alcohol. This is during Prohibition. Over 8 years, they were raided multiple times. Alcohol was confiscated. In one raid, the police collected 200 gallons of wine in bottles, jugs, and small barrels. But the patrons went to court and testified that the owners refused to sell them alcohol. So the judge returned all the alcohol to them because having 200 gallons of wine is just personal use, apparently, at that point in time. After being raided often enough, they finally sold the hotel again, and different owners came in and the raids continued. So obviously the Italian Swiss patrons did enjoy the opportunity to engage in a little bit of wine from the, as they would in the old country. Bordori, after he had sold, had gone off and bought a ranch out in the Soquel area. And in 1926, he sold his ranch and bought this building across the street from the Swiss hotel. Obviously, by this point in time, the police raids, the changing ownership, the Swiss hotel most likely had fallen into disrepute and was no longer doing a good business. And Bordori came out of his ranching activities and bought this building for $18,000 or $13,000 in 1926. On the corner, he opened a soft drink parlor, and which is about the only thing you could do because alcohol was still illegal. And he announced his intention to convert the building into a new hotel, where he would also have his residence. It took him 2 years to upgrade the building. He added a garage behind the hotel in 1928, and he opened it as the Swiss American Hotel. His business was raided in 1928 looking for bootleg liquor. Obviously, if he had a soft drink parlor and a hotel, and it was a Swiss American hotel across the street from the Swiss hotel, he must be bootlegging liquor as well. But the raids never found any liquor. And this is where we have the other 24 millimeter tokens. These are not slot machine size. So these were obviously used in his business. He had the soft drink parlor. He had a small grocery business next to it. And then next to that was the lobby for the hotel, and the rooms in the hotel were on the second floor. And there are two listed in Capon. This one, the 5-cent token with the dots, beads running around the obverse, and the 10-cent token, very similar. They're the same size. This one's aluminum, this one's brass. But the aluminum tokens were obviously better used because there's also an unlisted 5-cent token for the Swiss American Hotel with the dentate design running around the outside. The Swiss Hotel and the era of Borodori ended on May 3rd, 1948, when he committed suicide. His son, Guido, took over operation of the hotel following the death of his father. And in 1963, the Swiss American Hotel was finally demolished to facilitate the widening of Water Street. And that ends my talk for this evening. I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Bill.
Is the Swiss Hotel still
No.
there, the
No.
building?
No, in 63, it was torn down and they widened Water Street. So the building's there, and the lot that it was on is still there, but it's much smaller. So those buildings were all torn down in 63.
How did the post office survive?
The post office is still there. It's so they widened the street on the other side. Nobody was going to touch the post office, and it's
Sorry.
it's a massive sandstone and granite building, and it's still one of the buildings that Santa Cruz is proud of, because it does have that long history.
It has murals painted during the WPA era too, right, Bill?
Yeah, it's an old building, but it's still a grand building to enter and get mail or do business, like getting a passport or that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So
Bill, I want to talk about the money paying out machines. I kind of had a different interpretation of that prior to that law, they paid out nickels. And it was after that they did the tokens that said good for 5 cents in trade being essentially the same as in merchandise.
yeah, that was they may have done that to get away with it, so that it could have been after 1906, but there were slot machines that were paying out money into about 1927, 1930, when the problem that you had with slot machines paying out money being illegal is that most of the city fathers and businessmen enjoyed a drink or a cigar and played slot machines. So they were in the back rooms and they were still there. In fact, in the midst of them being illegal, there were articles in the paper when somebody would break into a business and break open the slot machines and steal the money. And so the slot machines are illegal, but the police are still being called to investigate the theft of money from slot machines. So the police were well aware of them until finally a movement said no more gambling, and then the police started confiscating the machines in Santa Cruz. So they were around for a while. So it may date after 1906, but
in my article that may or may not be this year's submission for me, I looked into a saloon, a post-earthquake saloon, so it was 1906 in San Francisco on Fillmore Street called Marx Brothers. It's a common token, but they were arrested for a scheme where you could turn the tokens back in and get money. And so, I think that was a fairly common thing, is that, if you knew the bartender, you could actually turn them in. You wouldn't get a nickel each, but you'd get, something. I think in these cases, they were given like 3 cents each.
Correct. There,
The operation on Fillmore Street, they busted like 4 or 5 guys, one of which was the Marx Brothers.
so there was a case in Santa Barbara where one cigar store owner was playing the slot machines in another cigar and winning the good for one cigar tokens, and won a large handful, which he wanted to trade in for cigars to take to his business to sell. The two of them got into a fight, and the one hit the other one with a lead pipe, and so they ended up in court for the fight, not the thing. So it was, I think it was quite common that if you when nobody was around to see, that you could trade in your tokens for money. So the gambling was still going on.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. I'm sure.
But technically, in 1906, they agreed not to use denominated tokens because those would represent money, and instead good for a cigar, good for a drink. And that's, that token may well have post-dated 1906.
So you have documentation to the fact they changed the words on the token?
The tokens that I know that were made after 1906 in cigar stores and bars are all good for something as opposed to cash. So I don't know that the Swiss Hotel necessarily ordered things with non-denominations on them, but technically they all agreed to stop using tokens that were good for money.
I have another question about the 24 millimeter tokens. You said they
Right.
were used for slot machines.
Pardon?
You said the 24 millimeter tokens that were later.
I don't believe those, they were both the same size, and I don't believe those were slot machine tokens. At that point in time, the soda pop companies, the soda fountains and so forth, were using tokens as change. And the Swiss, given what happened at the Swiss Hotel, I would be very surprised if Borodori actually had slot machines after he opened in 1926. That's at the time that the police were actually cracking down and removing slot machines. So I'm certain that those were used in actual everyday trade.
Well, the aluminum ones, obviously would be. So I suppose that
Right.
follows the brass ones were too.
Yeah. And the tokens from people who had saloons and then became soft drink and then went back to selling beer again, their tokens changed sizes after Prohibition. And I know some of them had slot machines, but in time they phased them out just because it became too hot to handle. Once the police started actually cracking down, as opposed to protecting their own after hours entertainment before they went home to their wives.
Yeah, Mike.
Hey, Bill, one thing I've really learned from you folks since I joined the society is about tokens, and you keep referring to these fire maps and stuff, and you showed an example of that. Can you comment for a few minutes about the fire maps or the insurance fire maps and stuff? Might be old hat to everyone else, but I don't know much about those.
So the fire maps, I don't know when they first started issuing them, but they are a good source of information about where businesses were located. I think they were issued from all around the United States. Michael's used them in research. I use them in research. The biggest problem that I have using the fire maps is trying to align street numbering on tokens with the street numbers shown on the fire maps, because early on, there didn't seem to be any consistency, that every now and then the streets would be, the buildings would be renumbered as things burned down or were torn down or are renumbered. But it does give you an idea of the layout. So when you read about a saloon that had a card room in the back, that'll show up on the fire maps.
So how does one access the fire maps? Where are they archived?
So you have to go online and find them. The UC Santa Cruz Special Collections has a large collection of Sanborn fire maps that are digitized and are online. That's where all of my images came from. The Smithsonian has a large, Smithsonian or Library of Congress?
Library of Congress.
Library of Congress has a large collection of fire maps for if you're looking for other areas.
Was
So-
Sanborn a predominant player there? Is it done by national companies or regional?
No, I think
Insurance.
it's the National Fire Insurance Company.
Oh, thank you.
And it will show you some of them will tell you what the construction is of the common walls and so
Yeah.
forth. And it depends upon the quality of the information varies from year to year. And so, for example, the fire map that I showed that had the Swanton Hotel and the Swiss Hotel on it, that fire map was dated 1888, but the Swanton Hotel actually burned down in 1877. So the information on the map was 10 years old, more than 10 years old, even though it has an 1888 date on it. So it's
Thank you,
like,
Paul. You want to say something?
Yeah, I in connection with the question of where you can find the Sanborn maps in San Francisco, for the Sanborn maps for San Francisco, they have them at the San Francisco Heritage Organization, which is in the Haas Lilienthal House on Franklin Street, and it's on in their archive on the top floor.
Right, and
Those are the physical maps.
Those are the physical maps. Yeah.
wow, because I know that the library has, the History Center at the public library has
Probably
scans
there.
of them.
Yeah, right.
I think a lot of libraries actually have the physical ones too. I think they have them in Denver, for instance, but finding the digitized ones is a lot easier, of course. They're great big things.
Yeah,
You know, they'd be half the size of the
Yeah.
tables in the room we're in.
Yeah.
Well, the full table.
It's great to actually see the originals. So they're big books, and it's just for the old ones, it's just a pleasure to actually
yeah.
use them.
Since you guys
Thanks a
like
lot.
things.
if you're looking at a token,
I missed that. What did you say?
He said, since you guys like to hold things,
Oh, yeah,
books, printed things.
that's right. Yeah. Well, if it's not coins, it's got to be something else.
they're really valuable if you're researching tokens and want to understand history and sort of the physical environment in which a business is located and what's around it and how they're an invaluable source of information.
Right.
Yeah.
There's one other thing you should know too, is there's a lot of abbreviations, but
Yeah.
it's easy to find a guide to what the things mean.
Right.
You know, SAL is saloon, for instance.
Right.
But REST is restaurant, but there's a whole slew of these things,
Right, and some of them were color coded
and some are color coded.
by what business was located there.